Ruth Bailey had been asked to leave 3 towns before she turned 24, and every single time the reason given was the same: she was simply too much. Too loud when she laughed, which she did often and without apology. Too sharp when she spoke, which she did directly and without softening the edges. Too stubborn when she believed in something, which was most hours of the day. Too bright-eyed for a woman who had seen what she had seen. Too warm-hearted for a person who had been given as little warmth as she had received. Her mother had told her when she was barely 7 years old, sitting at the edge of a creek bed in the Kansas heat, that a woman who takes up too much space will always find herself crowded out of every room she enters. Ruth had listened carefully, the way children do when they sense the lesson is really about the person giving it, and she had filed that information away not as a warning, but as a map of everything she did not want to become. She was 25 years old in the spring of 1878 when she arrived in Colton Creek, Texas, on the back of a stage coach that smelled of leather and dried sweat, and something else she could never quite name but suspected was regret. She had a single trunk, a rifle she had owned since she was 16, and a letter of introduction from a woman named Clara Frost who had told her that Colton Creek needed a schoolteacher, and that Ruth's credentials, modest as they were, would more than suffice. Clara had not mentioned that Colton Creek was barely a town at all, more a collection of ambitions arranged along a single main street, with a general store, a saloon called the Amber Wheel, a small church that leaned slightly to the left as though tired of standing upright, and a scattering of homes that radiated outward from this modest center like spokes on a wheel that had never quite been finished. Ruth stepped down from the stage and stood in the dust and the heat and the particular quality of silence that exists in places that are too small to generate much noise, and she looked at all of it and thought, well, this is something. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped conversations, but she was striking in the way that started them. Her hair was dark and heavy, and she wore it pinned up with a kind of impatience, as though she had done it quickly and intended to do it better later and had never quite gotten around to it. Her eyes were the color of creek water over dark stone, and they moved quickly, cataloging everything they landed on with an attention that some people found flattering and others found unsettling. She was tall for a woman of her time, and she carried herself without apology, shoulders back, chin level, the kind of posture that comes not from pride but from the habit of meeting things head-on. The town of Colton Creek looked her over in return. She was met at the stage by Clara Frost herself, who turned out to be a small, practical woman in her 50s with a handshake like a vice grip and eyes that had assessed everything she had ever looked at and found most of it wanting but workable. Clara walked Ruth to the small 2-room house at the edge of town that would serve as her residence and schoolhouse both, explained the arrangements in a rapid, no-nonsense manner, and then said, almost as an afterthought, that Ruth should be prepared for a certain degree of resistance from some of the townspeople, because Colton Creek had its opinions and was not shy about sharing them. "What kind of resistance?" Ruth asked, setting her trunk down on the rough wooden floor. "The usual kind," Clara said. "The kind that says you don't belong here and means it differently depending on who's saying it." Ruth had encountered the usual kind before. She thanked Clara, who left without much ceremony, and then Ruth stood in the middle of her new home and listened to the wind move through the gaps in the walls and decided that she liked the place well enough for now. School began 3 days after her arrival. She had 11 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, children of ranchers and shopkeepers, and one boy whose father was the town's only blacksmith, and who arrived every morning with his hands already darkened with the residue of iron. Ruth threw herself into the work with the total commitment she gave to everything, which meant that by the end of the first week she had 3 parents come to see her with varying degrees of concern about her methods. She taught the children to argue. She encouraged them to ask questions. She assigned a girl named Maggie Greer, who was 10 years old and had a gift for figures, to solve problems on the board in front of the class, because Ruth had decided early that she would not pretend that only the boys in her classroom were worth developing. This produced predictable results. Hector Greer, Maggie's father, came to see Ruth on a Friday afternoon while the light was going orange through the windows, and told her in a reasonable but firm tone that he didn't think it was appropriate for Maggie to be put forward that way, as it would give the girl ideas. Ruth had heard this argument in its various forms before. She thanked Mr. Greer for his time, offered him coffee, which he declined, and then told him very clearly that Maggie had a mind like a steel trap, and that the only disservice Ruth could do to that child was to pretend otherwise, and that she understood if he wanted to remove Maggie from her class, but that she would not change her approach on the matter. Hector Greer stared at her for a long moment. "You are a very direct woman," he said. "I have been told so," Ruth said pleasantly. He left without removing Maggie from the class, which Ruth took as a partial victory, and she went back to her desk and marked papers until the light was entirely gone. It was 2 weeks into her time in Colton Creek when she first saw Matthew Keating. She was at the general store, which was run by a man named Horace Webb and his wife Dolly, who had collectively the most information about everything that happened in the county and the least apparent awareness of how much they knew. Ruth was purchasing flour and dried beans and a small jar of honey, which she allowed herself as a weekly indulgence, when the door opened and the quality of the room changed in the way that rooms change when someone walks in who takes up a particular kind of space. He was not the tallest man she had ever seen, but he was built in a way that suggested everything was where it was supposed to be, with a lean, deliberate quality to the way he moved, like someone who had learned through long experience to conserve energy for things that actually required it. He had dark hair that was slightly too long for complete respectability, and a jaw that was strong without being aggressive, and eyes that were a very specific shade of gray-green that Ruth found herself noticing, and then noticing that she had noticed, and then returning her attention firmly to Dolly Webb and her flour. He was wearing the dust of the range on his coat and boots, and he carried his hat in his hand rather than on his head, which Ruth found was often a small but telling indicator of something, though she wasn't sure what. He nodded to Horace Webb behind the counter. "Morning, Horace. Matthew, you're in early. Needed to be in town. Caught a fence break out near the east pasture last night. Been at it since before light." He set a list on the counter, and then his eyes found Ruth in the natural way that eyes find things they are unexpectedly interested in, and he nodded to her with the uncomplicated friendliness of someone who had grown up in places where you greeted everyone because there wasn't enough population to be selective. "Ma'am." "Good morning," Ruth said. There was a brief and unremarkable moment, the kind that you don't remember later because you don't know yet that you should. Then she paid for her goods and left, and Matthew Keating bought his fence wire and went back to his ranch, and that was that, for about 4 more days. She met him properly at the church social that Clara Frost organized at the end of Ruth's second week, an event that Clara had made clear was both optional and mandatory in the way that only small-town institutions can be simultaneously both. The social was held in the yard behind the church on a warm evening, with tables of food and a fiddle player, and the particular quality of forced joyfulness that happens when people who have been working hard for a long time allow themselves an evening not to. Ruth wore her best dress, which was a dark blue that Dolly Webb had told her admiringly was a fine color on her, and she had actually taken time with her hair for once, and she stood at the edge of the gathering with a cup of sweet tea and watched the town she was slowly learning. Clara found her and introduced her around with brisk efficiency. She met the Reverend, a gentle man named Porter who apologized in advance for the quality of his sermons. She met the doctor, a tired-looking man named Aldrich. She met several ranching families whose names she cataloged carefully. And then Clara steered her toward a group near the fence and said, "Matthew Keating, this is Ruth Bailey, our new teacher, and Ruth looked up and found the gray-green eyes from the general store looking back at her with a warmth that she hadn't seen from them in that brief first encounter. "We met at the store," he said, extending his hand. His handshake was firm but not performative about it. "I'm sorry I wasn't more sociable that morning. I'd been up since 3 and I think I'd left most of my manners at the house." "You were perfectly civil," Ruth said. "I barely noticed." He smiled at that, a real smile, not the careful, measured one she had been receiving from most of the town's population since her arrival. "How are you finding Colton Creek?" "I find it every morning right where I left it," she said, "which is more than I can say for some towns." He looked at her with an expression she would come to know well, a kind of delighted attention, as though she had said something he had been waiting to hear without knowing he was waiting. "You've lived in places that moved on you." "3 of them," she said, and meant it lightly but found she meant it more deeply than she intended. He nodded, and there was something in that nod that felt like acknowledgement rather than sympathy, which she preferred. They talked for a while, standing at the edge of the gathering as the fiddle played, and the children ran through the early dark, and the stars began to emerge one by one over the Texas plains. She learned that he was 28 years old, that he had come to Colton Creek 4 years prior from Missouri, that he ran a cattle ranch called the Keating spread about 5 miles north of town, that he had 2 ranch hands and a horse he was extremely fond of named Calico, and that he had a directness to his conversation that matched her own, and that she found she had not been expecting from anyone in this particular town. "What brought you to Colton Creek originally?" she asked. "The land," he said simply. "I wanted land that was mine, and I couldn't afford it in Missouri, and I couldn't afford it in Kansas, and I came far enough south that I could." He paused. "And it suited me. The space here, I do better with space. I would have thought you'd want neighbors closer. I have neighbors close enough. 5 miles is nothing on horseback." He looked at her with that direct gray-green gaze. "What brought you here?" "Clara's letter," she said, "and the fact that this was the first town to offer me a teaching position in 11 months. He absorbed this without the judgment she had expected. "You're a long way from wherever you started." "I'm exactly where the road put me," she said. And then, because he had a way of making her say more than she usually did, she added, "Which is a thing I've had to make peace with more than once." The social ended, and she went home and thought about the conversation with more frequency than she meant to for the next several days. Matthew Keating was not a man who did things without intention. He had come to Colton Creek because he had looked at the land and decided it was where he wanted to make his life, and he had built his ranch with the same deliberate and unglamorous effort that real building requires. He was not a man given to impulsiveness or to the grand romantic gestures that the dime novels of the era celebrated, but he had a quality that was rarer and, Ruth would come to discover, more valuable. He paid attention. He paid attention to everything, to the weather and the grass and the temperament of his cattle, and the way the light changed over the plains in different seasons, and he paid attention to people with the same careful interest, which meant that when something caught his attention, it caught it fully and stayed caught. Ruth Bailey caught his attention at the church social and stayed there. He found reasons to be in town more frequently than his usual schedule required. He stopped by the schoolhouse one afternoon on the pretext of asking whether she needed help with a persistent leak he had heard about from Horace Webb, and she showed him the leak, and he fixed it in 20 minutes with the practical competence of someone who had been repairing his own structures for years. And then they sat on the step of the schoolhouse in the late afternoon and talked for an hour about whether the education system as it existed was serving anyone well. A conversation that became so animated that the Reverend Porter passing by on the road stopped and watched them with an expression of bemused pleasure before waving and moving on. "You argue beautifully," Matthew told her when she had finished making a particularly vigorous point about the importance of teaching girls the same subjects as boys. She stopped and looked at him. "Most people don't say that like a compliment." "It is one," he said. She studied him for a moment. In her experience, men who said things like that were either being condescending in a very sophisticated way or they were telling the truth. And Matthew Keating had a face that was, she was discovering, a poor instrument for hiding what he actually meant. His eyes were too direct for that kind of maneuvering. "Where did you come from before Missouri?" she asked. "Ohio, originally. Grew up on a farm." "My mother was a school teacher." "Was she?" "She was." He looked out at the road in front of them, the dust settling in the amber light. "She was also the most opinionated person I have ever met in my life, including everyone I've met since. She had a view on everything, and she shared it freely. And my father loved that about her so thoroughly that he told her once he would have married someone entirely wrong for him if she hadn't walked into his life talking about something he no longer remembered but was very interested in." Ruth felt something in her chest do a small, complicated thing that she chose not to examine. "She sounds like a remarkable person." She was. The past tense was quiet and she didn't ask about it. "She taught me that a woman with strong opinions is not a problem. She's a person with a mind that's working." He turned back to look at Ruth. "That seems obvious to me. I've always been confused by people who see it as otherwise." Ruth held very still for a moment, the way you hold still when something lands that you weren't prepared for. "I've been asked to be quieter more times than I can count," she said. "Softer. Less." "Were you any of those things after being asked?" "Never," she said. "Good," he said. They sat in the warm, fading light, and the conversation turned to other things, and Ruth rode home that evening on the edge of something she wasn't ready to name, but was finding increasingly difficult to avoid. The trouble with Colton Creek arrived, as trouble usually does in small towns, wrapped in the appearance of something else entirely. A man named Dale Whitmore had been the dominant figure in the county's ranching community for a decade, and he did not appreciate the changes that were arriving in Colton Creek with the same regularity as the stage coaches. More settlers, more structure, more schoolteachers with opinions about how things ought to be done. He was a broad, self-satisfied man in his mid-40s who had learned early that size and money, and a loud voice, could substitute effectively for most of the things he actually lacked. And he had been using these tools to shape the county to his preferences for long enough that he had forgotten they were tools, and had come to believe they were simply the natural order of things. He came to the school on a Tuesday morning in Ruth's fifth week, while the children were at their slates, and he stood in the doorway with his hat still on, and told her in a carrying voice that he had heard she was teaching the children things they didn't need to know, and that he'd like her to understand that the way things were done in Colton Creek had worked fine before she arrived, and would work fine after she left. Ruth sent the children outside for an early recess. Then she turned to Dale Whitmore and looked at him with the clear, steady gaze she had developed over a lifetime of being told to look away. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I appreciate you taking the time to come and share your concerns. I want to be very clear with you that I will hear any specific complaint about the content of my teaching and address it through the proper arrangement with the school board. If you have a general objection to the fact of my teaching, I'm afraid that conversation is not one I can have with you, as my position here was established by the school board and not by your preference." Whitmore stared at her. "You're quite a piece of work," he said. "I've been told so," Ruth said. He left, but she had the clear sense that he was not done and she was right. He spent the following days making small, persistent difficulties. A complaint to 2 members of the school board about the content of her lessons. A pointed conversation with Hector Greer that almost resulted in Maggie's removal from the school. A word to the owner of the Amber Wheel that resulted in the delivery of her monthly supply of firewood being delayed by 2 weeks. None of it broke her, because nothing had ever broken her, but it accumulated in the way that small cruelties do, and there were nights when she sat by her stove in the first real cold of the approaching autumn, and felt the particular exhaustion of being a person who has to fight the same battles over and over in different places, with different faces, wearing the same expression. It was on one of those nights that Matthew Keating knocked on her door. She opened it to find him standing on her step in the dark with his hat in his hand, and an expression that told her he had heard something and had not been able to let it alone. She let him in and set coffee on, and they sat at her small table while the wind pressed against the window. "I heard about Whitmore," he said. "Horace Webb. Dolly, actually. She is a force of nature, and I am grateful for it." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "I want you to know that there are people in this town who don't agree with what he's doing." "I know," she said. "Clara has been very clear about that, and Dolly, and the Reverend in his mild way." "I want you to know specifically that I don't agree with it," he said, and the directness of it, the plain, undressed fact of it, did the same thing to her chest that his words on the schoolhouse step had done, only more so. She looked at him across the table. He was watching her with that full, careful attention of his, and she had the sudden vivid awareness that this was a man who, when he looked at something, actually saw it, and that what he was seeing when he looked at her was not a problem to be managed or a situation to be handled, but a person, entire and real and exactly as she was. "Thank you," she said. "That means something. I also want to say," he continued in a slightly more careful tone, "that I've been finding more reasons to come into town than my schedule honestly requires." Ruth set down her coffee cup. "I've noticed," she said. "I thought you might." He turned his cup in his hands, a small and uncharacteristic gesture that she recognized as the thing his hands did when he was being more vulnerable than usual. "I don't say things I don't mean, Ruth. I want you to know that about me if you don't already." "I think I do already," she said. "Then I'll say it plainly." He met her eyes. "I would like, if you're willing, to spend more time with you, not through arranged coincidences at the general store, properly, with intention." The wind moved against the window, and the lamplight moved, and Ruth Bailey sat across from Matthew Keating, and felt the thing she had been not naming for weeks move into clarity like a figure stepping out of fog. "I'm willing," she said. He smiled then, the full version of the smile she had first seen at the church social, and it changed the whole quality of his face in a way that she thought she could probably look at for a very long time without minding. They began walking out together in the way of that time and place, which meant that people noticed immediately and had opinions about it immediately, and that both Ruth and Matthew declined to be particularly affected by either the noticing or the opinions. He came to her on Sundays, and they rode out onto the plains together, which she loved with a depth that surprised her, the vast flat openness of the Texas grassland under the enormous sky, the sense of being small in a space that was too large for smallness to be an insult. He was a wonderful companion on horseback and on foot, someone who was equally at home with silence and with conversation, who never seemed to need to fill quiet with noise for its own sake, which was a quality she valued enormously given how much noise had been made about her own silences over the years. He told her about his ranch, the 300 head of cattle he had built up from 50, the ongoing battle with the dry summers and the fence lines, and the market prices that swung unpredictably based on factors entirely beyond his control. He talked about it with the pragmatic love of someone who had chosen something difficult and found that the choosing was the point. She told him about her previous towns, about the way she had been moved along from each of them, and she tried to tell it lightly, but he listened with a gravity that made her see it more clearly than she usually allowed herself to. 3 towns, he said. They were sitting on a flat rock at the edge of the creek that ran through the corner of his property, watching the water in the October light. And all 3 for the same reason. Variations on the same reason, she said. Too opinionated, too loud, too unwilling to be what I was supposed to be. She picked up a small stone and turned it in her fingers. The first one, I was 20. I had gone to Harrington, Kansas, to teach, and I lasted 7 months before the school board informed me that my approach was not compatible with their community standards. The second town, I lasted almost a year before a preacher made it his personal mission to convince the town that I was a corrupting influence. The third one, she paused. The third one was the hardest. I had thought I was building something there. I had friends. I had a routine. And then someone decided I was too much trouble to keep around. Matthew was quiet for a moment. What did they say exactly? The school board chairman, she said carefully, told me that I was a fine teacher but that I had a personality that made people uncomfortable, and that a town needed harmony more than it needed excellence, and that perhaps I would find my right place eventually, but it was not with them. Matthew made a sound that she could not interpret as anything other than disgust. He said that to your face. He said it in a meeting with 4 other people present. And what did you say? I thanked him for his candor, Ruth said, and I picked up my things and I left and I cried for about 2 days in a boarding house in the next town over, and then I wrote to Clara Frost. The honesty of the admission surprised her as she made it. She did not usually tell people about the 2 days in the boarding house. Matthew didn't try to fix it or dismiss it. He just held the information with the same careful attention he held everything, and then he put his hand over hers where it rested on the rock, and she felt the warmth of it and didn't move away. I want to say something to you, he said, and I want you to hear it and not brush it aside the way I suspect you might if I don't ask you not to. She looked at him. All right. You are not too much, he said. You are exactly the right amount. Every part of you that those people tried to sand down or silence or remove, those are the parts I have been, without knowing it, looking for since I was old enough to know what I wanted to find. He turned to face her fully. I mean that without decoration or exaggeration. I have met a great many people in my life, and I have never met someone who was more exactly themselves than you are. That is not a problem, Ruth. That is a gift. And anyone who ever told you different was wrong, and I am sorry they got there first and I didn't. Ruth Bailey, who had walked out of 3 towns without flinching, and who had stood in front of Dale Whitmore without blinking, and who had made a practice for her entire adult life of meeting things with her chin up and her shoulders back, felt her eyes fill with tears that she blinked at twice before one of them got away from her and made its way down her cheek. She did not have a great deal of experience with being seen. Matthew lifted his hand from hers and very gently, with one thumb, brushed the tear away, and the gesture was so quietly tender that she had to look away for a moment at the creek and the light and the October plains. I'm not crying, she said. I know, he said, which made her laugh, which broke the emotion into something lighter and easier. And then they sat in the last of the afternoon warmth and watched the water move, and Ruth Bailey thought that she might be falling in love with this man. And then she thought that she was probably already there and had been for some time. The matter of Dale Whitmore came to a head in November, as the cold settled over the plains and the shorter days made everyone in Colton Creek spend more time in close proximity, and consequently more time in each other's business. Whitmore had not given up on his campaign against Ruth's continued tenure in Colton Creek, and he had finally found an ally of sorts in a new member of the school board, a man named Grover Addis, who had arrived in October with money from an Eastern cattle consortium, and the kind of certainty about the right way to do things that always seemed to follow Eastern money westward. Addis requested a formal meeting of the school board to review Ruth's teaching methods and conduct, and Ruth received the notice with the tired recognition of someone who has been here before. She told Matthew about it that Sunday, sitting in his ranch house kitchen with coffee and the smell of the beef stew he had made for both of them and the wind moving around the building with increasing winter purpose. I want to come to the meeting, Matthew said immediately. I don't need rescuing, Ruth said. I know that, he said with a patience she had come to love. I didn't say you needed rescuing. I said I want to come. There's a difference. You know how to fight your own battles. I know that better than anyone, but a person shouldn't have to fight alone when there are people standing right next to them who are willing to stand up and be counted. She looked at him. He was right and she knew it, and she was also aware of the novelty of the situation, of there being someone standing next to her who actually wanted to stand next to her, not out of obligation or performance but because he chose it. All right, she said. The meeting was held in the church, which was the largest space in Colton Creek available for a civic gathering, and most of the town came, either out of interest or out of the social compact that makes attendance at public events in small communities a kind of implicit obligation. Ruth sat at the front with Clara Frost on one side and Matthew Keating on the other, and she sat very straight and very still, and kept her face arranged in the expression she had developed over years of being assessed in public, attentive, calm, unafraid. Grover Addis made his case in the measured tones of someone who had practiced it, citing the complaints that had been lodged, the concerns about Ruth's methods, the general disruption to what he called the settled nature of the community. Whitmore sat beside him and said nothing, but projected a self-satisfaction that Ruth found simultaneously predictable and exhausting. Ruth was given the floor to respond. She stood and she looked at the assembled faces of Colton Creek, and she said, very clearly, that she had come here to teach children, and that she had been teaching them with everything she had, and that her methods were based on the conviction that every child in that classroom deserved to be educated to the fullest extent of their ability, regardless of their sex or their family's standing. She said that she knew not everyone agreed with that approach. She said that she was not going to change it, because the children she was teaching were going to grow up and face a world that would demand more from them than the ability to copy letters from a board, and she intended to give them more. She said that if that made her too much trouble, she would hear that verdict from the whole board and accept it, but that she was not going to pretend to be less than she was in order to avoid the discomfort of people who found her inconvenient. The silence after she spoke was the particular silence of a room in which something has happened. And then, from the middle of the assembled gathering, Hector Greer stood up. "I'd like to say something," Hector said, in the slightly awkward tone of a man who does not often speak in public and is aware of it. "I came to see Miss Bailey about 6 weeks ago with a complaint about my daughter Maggie." He paused. "And she told me something I didn't want to hear, which was that Maggie had a fine mind and deserved to use it. I didn't like hearing that. But Maggie came home last week and did figures in her head faster than I could do them on paper, and she was so happy about it that I thought," he cleared his throat, "I think Miss Bailey should stay." Then other voices followed, people Ruth had met and some she had not, parents and neighbors, and finally Clara Frost, who stood and said in her crisp, decisive way that the school board had hired Ruth Bailey in good faith, and that she had performed her duties with exceptional dedication, and that any member of this board who voted to remove her would need to answer for that decision to Clara personally, which Clara said in a tone that made very clear what answering to Clara personally entailed. The vote was taken, and Ruth was retained by a margin that surprised even Clara. After the meeting, outside in the cold night air with the stars sharp and brilliant above the plains, Matthew came to stand beside her while the crowd dispersed in small, talking groups. "You didn't need rescuing," he said, with the smile that had become her favorite version of his face. "I told you I didn't," she said. "You were magnificent," he said. Ruth looked up at the stars for a moment. The cold was clean, and the air smelled of winter grass and wood smoke, and the particular sharpness of a Texas night in November. She felt the warmth of him beside her and the residual electricity of everything that had just happened, and the deep, settled satisfaction of having stood in her own truth and not bent. "Matthew," she said. "Yes." "I love you," she said. "I think I have for a while, and I've been being careful about saying it, which is not something I do often, and I've decided it's taking too long." He was quiet for exactly one breath, and then he turned to face her, and his expression was the fullest, most unguarded thing she had seen on anyone's face in a very long time. "I love you too," he said. "I have loved you since approximately the night you told me about the boarding house and cried one tear and told me you weren't crying." She laughed, and the laugh went up into the cold night air and scattered among the stars. He kissed her then, for the first time, there in front of the church with the Reverend Porter just going inside, and the last members of the town's population dispersing home through the dark. It was not tentative. It was the kind of kiss that confirms something that has been building for a long time, warm and certain and thorough. His hands on her face with the same careful attention he gave everything he touched. And when he pulled back, she stood for a moment with her eyes closed, and the cold air on her face and the warmth of him still close, and thought, "This is what it feels like to be found." Winter settled over Colton Creek in earnest, and it was the best winter of Ruth Bailey's adult life, which was not something she had expected to be able to say about a winter in a small Texas town that smelled of cattle and wood smoke and had a church that leaned to the left. She and Matthew saw each other as often as the weather and their respective work allowed, and in the spaces in between she thought about him with a frequency that would have alarmed her in another season of her life, but that she had decided to allow fully, because she had spent enough years being careful, and this was not a thing she wanted to be careful about. He came for dinner on Fridays when the roads were passable. She went out to the ranch on Sundays and learned what it meant to understand cattle country from the inside, which was nothing like what she had imagined. She learned the rhythm of the ranch, the early mornings and the endless physical work, and the particular satisfaction of a place that existed because you had made it so. His two ranch hands, brothers named Carl and Pete Emery, were young men in their early 20s who treated Ruth with the cheerful deference of people who could see very clearly which way the wind was blowing and were entirely in favor of the direction. Christmas arrived, and Matthew gave her a book he had ordered from a catalog 3 months prior, a book of natural history that had illustrations. She spent the whole of Christmas Day sitting at his kitchen table turning through, while he watched her with the expression she had come to know as his happiest one. She gave him a pair of leather riding gloves that she had ordered from the saddle maker in the next town, and had stitched his initials into herself over several evenings, which had taken more effort than she would admit in anything but a private conversation, and he held them with a reverence that made the stitching seem more than worth it. "These are the finest gloves I have ever owned," he said. "They are certainly the finest gloves I have ever made," she said, "given that they are the only gloves I have ever made." He put them on and held his hands up to look at the initials. "M.K., in case you forget who you are," she said. He looked at her with such undisguised love that she had to look at the book again to have somewhere to put her eyes. January brought hard weather, the kind that tests the structural integrity of everything: buildings, relationships, and resolve. A stretch of bitter cold killed several head of cattle at the Keating spread, and Matthew spent 2 weeks in conditions that would have broken people with less stubbornness and determination. Ruth saw him when she could and brought food to the ranch when the roads allowed, and was useful in the practical ways that she had discovered were, in a life like this, the deepest form of tenderness. When the cold broke in the first week of February, and the damage was tallied and found to be significant but not catastrophic, Matthew sat at his kitchen table with the numbers in front of him, and Ruth sat across from him, and they talked through it with the clear-eyed practicality of two people who have both, in their different ways, learned to look at hard things directly rather than sideways. "It'll set the expansion back by a season," he said, "maybe 2. "That's survivable," she said. "It is." He looked up from the numbers. "I had been thinking about asking you something, and I'd decided to wait until the situation was more settled financially. The cattle losses changed that picture." Ruth looked at him steadily. "Ask it anyway." He set down his pencil and looked at her across the table with the full, honest gravity of a man who means everything he says. "Ruth Bailey," he said, "I want to marry you. I want to spend my life being in the same room with your opinions and your laugh and the way you look at things. I want the children you teach at that school to grow up knowing what it looks like when two people choose each other on purpose. I am not a wealthy man, and this winter has made me less wealthy than I was, and I won't be able to give you the kind of beginning I would have chosen. But I can tell you with absolute honesty that there is no one on this earth I would rather build something with." Ruth set down the piece of bread she had been holding. She looked at him and felt the whole history of herself. The towns that had asked her to leave, the people who had told her she was too much, the years of carrying herself upright through places that didn't want her exactly as she was. And she felt all of it arrange itself around this moment like the landscape arranges itself around a single landmark, and suddenly make sense. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes. Matthew, it has been yes for months." He came around the table and kissed her and then held her in a way that was less about romance and more about the particular relief of a man who has been afraid of something and found he didn't need to be. And she held him back with the same quality of feeling. And outside the window the February plains were beginning to show the faint earliest suggestion of a returning warmth. They were married in April, when the wildflowers were coming up through the Texas grass, and the sky was the enormous, theatrical blue of a spring that has taken its time arriving. The ceremony was held in the church, which had been subtly and bravely reinforced by the Reverend Porter over the winter, and now stood slightly more perpendicular to the ground than it had before. And most of Colton Creek attended, because it was the kind of event that a small town needs occasionally to remind itself of what it is at its best. Ruth wore a dress of ivory-colored cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs that Clara Frost had presented to her the week before, with the explanation that it had been made for her own sister's wedding 20 years ago, and that Clara had decided, without consultation, that it was exactly right for Ruth, a decision that Ruth found difficult to argue with when she looked in the mirror. She wore her hair pinned up more carefully than usual, and she walked down the aisle of the leaning church past the faces of the people who had become, in the 7 months since she had arrived on a stage coach smelling of leather and regret, the closest thing she had in a very long time to a real community. Matthew stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that fit him well, and with an expression that Ruth would describe later as the most nakedly happy she had ever seen on a human face. And when she reached him and took his hands and the Reverend Porter began to speak, she felt none of the fear or the doubt or the careful self-protective hesitation that had accompanied most of the important moments of her life. She felt absolutely clear. They said their vows to each other in front of everyone, and they meant every word, and the church full of Colton Creek heard it and believed them. After the ceremony, there was a celebration in the yard behind the church, with the same fiddle player from the social where they had first properly met, and there was food that half the town had contributed to and whiskey that came from a source that the Reverend Porter did not ask about, and there was dancing on the hard-packed earth under the April sky. Matthew danced with Ruth until they were both laughing and breathless, and then they danced some more, because they could, because this was the kind of evening that does not come often and deserves its full measure of attention. Dolly Webb cried. Clara Frost did not cry, but stood at the edge of the celebration, with an expression of such profound satisfaction that it amounted to the same thing. Little Maggie Greer, now 11 and already something like a force of nature in the mathematics department, brought Ruth a bouquet of wildflowers that she had clearly collected herself with great seriousness from the fields at the edge of town, and Ruth thanked her with the genuine warmth that she gave to children who reminded her of who she had been. Dale Whitmore was not there. He had, over the winter, found that his influence in Colton Creek had diminished in proportion to his efforts to make things difficult for Ruth, which had produced an effect opposite to the one he intended, as heavy-handedness tends to do in communities small enough that everyone can see exactly what is being done. He still ran his ranch and was still a presence in the county, but Colton Creek had rendered its judgment, and he had absorbed it with the sullen resignation of a man who has lost something he did not think he could lose. Grover Addis had quietly departed Colton Creek for other opportunities in March. The school board had replaced him with a woman from east of town who had been teaching her own children at home and had opinions about education that aligned closely enough with Ruth's that their first meeting had turned into a 3-hour conversation that both of them had found thoroughly satisfying. Life at the Keating spread with Ruth Bailey Keating in it was different from life at the Keating spread before, and Matthew was aware of this every day in the way that you are aware of warmth when you have been accustomed to cold. She filled the house with energy and noise and opinion and books, and she had opinions about where things should go and how the kitchen should be organized, and a very specific view about which field should be planted with what. And Carl and Pete Emery found her simultaneously a little terrifying and entirely wonderful, which was approximately how Matthew felt about her too, in the best possible way. She continued teaching, because she was not going to stop teaching, and Matthew had never for a single moment suggested she should, and the school that year had 14 students and a waiting list for the following year, because word had gotten around that Miss Bailey, now Mrs. Keating, was a teacher worth the walk. In the summer of that year, something happened that Ruth had half hoped for and half feared, which was that she became aware she was expecting a child. She told Matthew on a warm August evening sitting on the porch of the ranch house with the stars coming out over the plains, saying it in the direct way she said everything, and he sat very still for a moment, and then put his face in his hands in the way men do when they are overwhelmed by something good and don't have another mechanism for it. And she put her hand on his back and felt him breathe, and then he looked up and his face was everything she needed to see. "Are you well?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "I'm well," she said. "I feel like myself, only more so." He laughed and it came out unsteady in the best way. "A boy or a girl, do you think?" "I have no idea," she said. "I'll love either one equally and completely, so it doesn't matter to me at all." "Me neither," he said. He took her hand. "Though I hope if it's a girl she has your eyes. And if it's a boy, then I hope he has your arguments," Matthew said. The pregnancy progressed well through the fall and into the winter, and Ruth taught until December before Clara, in her no-nonsense way, informed her that it was time to arrange for a temporary substitute, and that Clara herself had a suitable candidate in mind, and that Ruth should stop arguing about it and rest, all of which Ruth did with reasonable if not perfect grace. The substitute was a capable young man fresh from a teaching college in Austin, who was somewhat overwhelmed by the expectations. Ruth left him, but who rose to the occasion with impressive determination. Their son was born in late February, which felt appropriate to Matthew and Ruth both, given that it was the month they had gotten engaged, and that February had proved itself a season that brought them important things. He was a solid and emphatic baby who announced his arrival with the kind of conviction that made the doctor laugh and Dolly Webb, who had come to help, say that this child was going to have opinions, which she meant as the highest possible compliment. They named him Thomas, after Matthew's father, with the middle name Franklin, which had been the name of Ruth's grandfather on her mother's side, a man she had never met but who her mother had spoken of, with the particular reverence reserved for people who managed to live through hard times without losing their essential kindness. Thomas Keating came into the world in a ranch house on the Texas plains and found himself immediately in the center of a considerable quantity of love. Ruth returned to teaching in April when Thomas was 2 months old and well enough established in his habits to be left in the confident care of Dolly Webb, who had appointed herself honorary grandmother with the same decisiveness she applied to everything. The school had a new building that spring, one of the results of the shift in Colton Creek's civic priorities over the past year. A proper schoolhouse with a wood floor and enough windows to let the light in properly, and desks enough for all 14 of the current students with room for more. Ruth walked into it on the first day and stood in the middle of the new wood smell and the morning light and felt the particular satisfaction of having built something, even if the building was technically constructed by other people's hands. Maggie Greer stood in the doorway behind her with her slate and her serious expression and said, "Mrs. Keating, do you think we could do the long division today? I've been practicing." "We absolutely can," Ruth said. "Come in." The years built on each other in Colton Creek the way years do, in a place that has found its footing, not without difficulty or loss or the ongoing, ordinary weather of living, but with a quality of forward motion that feels earned rather than given. Matthew's ranch grew steadily through good seasons and survived the bad ones, and he hired 2 more hands and bought additional land to the north that he had been watching for 3 years, waiting for the moment when it came available at a price he could meet. He was a good rancher and a careful one, and the land responded to him, the way land responds to people who pay it proper attention. Thomas grew from an emphatic baby into an emphatic toddler, and then into a small boy who had his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's fundamental orientation toward the world, which was to meet it directly and with curiosity, and without much patience for being told to stand back. He began coming to the school with Ruth in the mornings before he was old enough to be an official student, sitting in the corner with his own small slate, while Ruth taught the older children, and she watched him absorb everything around him with the particular intensity of a child who is taking in more than adults assume children take in. When Thomas was 3, Ruth discovered she was expecting again, which she told Matthew in the same straightforward way she told him everything, this time in the kitchen on a winter morning over coffee with the smell of snow in the air. His response was the same as the first time, slightly adapted. He put down his cup very carefully and looked at her with an expression of such undisguised happiness that she had to laugh at the beauty of it. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. "Thomas is going to be insufferable about it," Matthew said, with the fond certainty of a father who knows his child well. "He'll either be the most devoted older brother in the county or the most territorial." "He'll be both," Ruth said, "in alternating hours." The second pregnancy was harder than the first in the physical ways and easier in the emotional ones, because Ruth had the confidence now of someone who had done this before and lived in a place that felt genuinely like home. She taught until later in the pregnancy than the first time, partly because she judged herself well enough and partly because she was deep in a particular project she had been developing for 2 years. A primer specifically designed for the children of Colton Creek that used examples from their actual world, rather than from the eastern cities that most available textbooks seemed to assume everyone lived in. Clara Frost had looked at the draft and said it was the best teaching material she had seen in 20 years, which from Clara constituted an extravagant compliment. The second child was a girl, born in the high summer when the heat lay over the plains in a thick, shimmering layer, and the cattle stood still in the shade, and the creek ran low over its stones. She arrived with considerably less fanfare than Thomas had, apparently conserving her energy for later demonstrations, and she was smaller and darker-haired, and looked from her first hours of life remarkably like the young Ruth Bailey that Ruth had only seen in a single daguerreotype taken when she was 4 years old, a picture she had carried with her through every town and every restart. They named her Eleanor, which was a name Ruth had loved since she was a girl without knowing exactly why, and Clara Frost was the one who cried this time, standing by the bed in a rare public display of emotion that she appeared to forgive herself for on the grounds that it was warranted. Thomas was 4 when Eleanor arrived, and he was, as Ruth had predicted, both devoted and territorial, and the combination produced a kind of comprehensive big brothering that Eleanor appeared to find entirely acceptable, regarding her brother from her earliest weeks with the calm, assessive gaze of someone who has determined that the arrangement works in her favor and sees no reason to object to it. By the time Thomas was 6 and Eleanor was nearly 2, and the year was turning toward 1885, Colton Creek had grown from its original collection of ambitions into something that could more legitimately be called a town, with 2 streets now and a better church and a bank that had opened in 1883, and the new schoolhouse, and a doctor who had arrived the previous year to assist the aging Dr. Aldrich. It was still small by the standards of cities, but it had a quality of genuine community that the best small places have, a sense of people who have chosen to be in the same place and are working out what that means together. Ruth's primer had been printed by a small publisher in Austin, who had found it through a letter of recommendation from a teacher in the next county, and had written to Ruth with an offer to produce it for distribution across the region. She had spent a month going back and forth about whether to accept, not because she doubted the primer's merit, but because the logistics of a publishing arrangement felt overwhelming on top of everything else, until Matthew sat her down and told her with characteristic directness that she had written something good, and that she should let it go out into the world, and that he would help her with whatever part of the process needed helping with, because that was what they did for each other. "You helped me through the cattle losses," he said. "You sat with me through the numbers, and you brought food to the ranch, and you never once made me feel like it was a problem you'd rather not be dealing with." "It wasn't," she said. "And this," he said, gesturing at the stack of pages on the table, "is not a problem I'd rather not be dealing with. This is your work, and it is good work, and I want it to go where it can do good. Let me help." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight, this man who had stood beside her at the church meeting and fixed the leak in her schoolhouse and told her she was exactly the right amount and asked her to build a life with him, and built it, genuinely and carefully, beside her. And she thought that she had been told her whole life she was too much, and he had spent theirs together showing her what it looked like to be found by exactly the right person. "All right," she said. "Let's write to Austin." The primer was published the following spring and distributed to schools across a wide region of Texas and into neighboring territories. And the first letter Ruth received about it was from a teacher in a small town 300 miles away, who said that her students were, for the first time, reading about things that looked like their own lives, and that the girl who had never been interested in reading had read the whole first section in one sitting, and that the teacher thanked Ruth with all the sincerity at her disposal. Ruth read the letter 3 times and then showed it to Matthew, who read it and handed it back and said, without any performance about it, "I knew that would happen." Thomas started school in the autumn of the year the primer was published, which Ruth found an experience that was both professionally straightforward and personally very strange. The strangeness being that she was simultaneously the teacher and the mother in the same room, which required a calibration she had not fully anticipated. Thomas, for his part, appeared to find this arrangement perfectly natural, distinguishing between the versions of Ruth with an instinctive and occasionally maddening precision, calling her Mrs. Keating when he raised his hand to answer a question and Mama when he scraped his knee at recess. Matthew found this tremendously funny and did not hide it well. "He's your son," Ruth told him on a Friday evening when Thomas had distinguished himself that week by correcting a classmate's arithmetic with a thoroughness that Ruth found both impressive and mortifying. "He's your son," Matthew said equably. "I just provided the structure." "The structure," she said. "The raw materials," he amended. "The content is entirely yours." She threw a dish towel at him, and he caught it, and they laughed in the kitchen of the house that had become, over the years, the most comfortable place Ruth Bailey had ever been in her life. Eleanor, who had been a quiet and watchful baby, emerged in her 3rd year as a person of definite and clearly articulated opinions, which surprised exactly no one who knew her parents. She had a particular passion for horses that had manifested without any particular encouragement. She had taken one look at Calico, Matthew's beloved mare, at the age of 18 months, and indicated with clear and unmistakable toddler urgency that she required closer proximity to this animal, an urgency that had not diminished in the intervening period. By the time she was 3, she was being placed on Calico's broad back by Matthew for short walks around the paddock that produced in Eleanor an expression of absolute, undisguised joy that Ruth kept tucked in the private part of her memory as one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. The ranch was doing well by 1886. The expansion Matthew had planned and delayed and then resumed had come to fruition, and the Keating spread was running 500 head and had acquired enough reputation in the county market that buyers came to them rather than requiring Matthew to seek them out. Carl Emery had married the previous year and brought his wife to live in the Hands cottage at the edge of the property, and Pete Emery had left to start his own small operation to the west, a departure that Matthew had supported with a practical generosity that Ruth had come to recognize as one of his most enduring qualities. He was not a man who made himself bigger by making others smaller, which was rarer than it should have been, and which she loved about him as much as any other thing. That summer, Ruth's mother came to visit. It was the first time Ruth's mother had come to her since Ruth had left home at 19, and the visit had been planned and replanned for 2 years, delayed by distance and weather, and the ordinary friction of complicated relationships. Ruth had a complicated relationship with her mother, which she was honest about to herself if not always to others. Her mother was a woman who had made her peace with smallness because she had never been given a model for what bigness looked like, and she had been so thorough about it that she had tried, with the best intentions and the worst timing, to give Ruth the same peace, and Ruth had spent the better part of a decade being angry about it before she had found enough clarity to understand it. Her mother arrived on the stage in July, smaller than Ruth remembered and older, and Ruth embraced her on the dusty main street of Colton Creek and felt the complicated truth of it, love and history, and the things that had been said and not said, and could not be unsaid or unstated, all of it folded together into the particular texture of a mother and daughter who are more alike than either has always been comfortable admitting. Matthew was at the stage to meet them, which Ruth had asked him not to be elaborate about, and which he consequently handled with the simple, natural warmth that he brought to everything. He shook her mother's hand and helped with her bag and said, "Ruth has told me a great deal about you," which was true, and her mother looked at him with the assessing eyes that she had given to Ruth and said, "And she has written me about you," and something passed between them in that exchange that Ruth watched from the side and thought, "Well, that's a beginning." Her mother stayed for 3 weeks. Thomas won her thoroughly within the first 2 days through the straightforward mechanism of demanding her undivided attention with a persistence and charm that she found impossible to resist. Alina was more considered in her approach, watching her grandmother from a careful distance for several days before deciding, apparently on the basis of some private evaluation, to accept her fully, after which she made her feelings known by sitting in her grandmother's lap every available evening and demanding stories. On the last night of the visit, Ruth and her mother sat on the porch after the children were in bed and Matthew had gone to check on the stock, and the Texas night came down around them with its stars and its warm darkness and its silence. "You are very happy here," her mother said. Not a question. "I am," Ruth said. Her mother was quiet for a moment. "I told you once that a woman who takes up too much space will always be crowded out." "You did," Ruth said. "I remember it exactly." "I was wrong," her mother said. "I knew it a long time ago and I should have told you sooner." She looked out at the dark plains. "I was afraid. It's easier to make yourself smaller than to risk the other thing. I thought I was protecting you." Ruth reached out and took her mother's hand. The thing she felt was not entirely forgiveness and not entirely understanding, but something that included both and more. The complicated mercy of a person who has found enough of what she needed that she can look at the people who didn't give it to her without bitterness. "You did your best," Ruth said and meant it. "Your best," her mother said with a small, rueful sound, "is only as good as what you understand at the time." She looked at Ruth with her Creekwater eyes. "He's a good man." "He is the best man I have ever known," Ruth said simply. "He looks at you like you're the most interesting thing he's ever seen." "He's told me something like that," Ruth said. Her mother squeezed her hand, and they sat in the comfortable silence of women who have come a long way from somewhere difficult and arrived, against various odds, somewhere good. Matthew's mother had died when he was 16, which was part of why he had spoken of her in the past tense on that afternoon by the creek. He had his father still, a quiet and weathered man named Robert Keating who lived in Missouri and wrote letters with the laborious care of someone who did not find writing natural, but considered it important enough to do anyway. He came to visit the following autumn, a big-framed man in his 60s who had aged into a dignified thinness, and who moved with the careful deliberateness of someone whose joints had been conducting negotiations with the rest of him for some years. Robert Keating looked at his son's ranch and his son's children, and his son's wife with the contained, evident pride of a man who does not make big demonstrations, but whose feelings are clear to anyone looking closely. He helped Thomas with a birdhouse construction project that had been ongoing for several weeks and reached a satisfactory conclusion during his visit. He told Eleanor stories about horses that she absorbed with the rapt attention of a child who has found her people. And on his last evening he sat on the porch with Matthew, and Ruth, inside washing up from dinner with her children talking around her knees, could hear the low, steady sound of their voices going back and forth in the dark, with a comfortable regularity that told her they were talking the way men talk when they are talking about something that matters. She didn't know what was said between them. She didn't ask. But the next morning at breakfast, Robert Keating looked at her across the table with Matthew's exact gray-green eyes and said, "I am glad my son found his way to you." And Ruth held that simply and without deflection and said, "I'm glad too." The years continued in the way of good years, which is to say they were full and sometimes hard, and never quite what was expected and better than the sum of their parts. Thomas, at 8, was everything his parents had produced, and then some methodical and curious, and given to arguments so logical that they occasionally left adults blinking in the dust of their own assumptions. He had discovered a passion for maps and geography that produced an elaborate ongoing project in his room involving string and pins, and a hand-drawn map of the territory that was growing more detailed and accurate every month. He wanted to travel, he told his parents seriously one Sunday, to see the places he was mapping, and Matthew had told him that was a fine ambition, and Ruth had told him that travel required a thorough understanding of history and geography, and he had taken both responses as useful information and filed them accordingly. Eleanor, at 5, was her own entire world. She rode Calico, who was now considerably older but seemed to find Eleanor's company restorative, and she had transferred her passion for horses into a broader passion for all animals and had accumulated, by a kind of gravitational inevitability, a small menagerie at the ranch consisting of a one-eared barn cat named Captain, 2 dogs of uncertain origin, and a series of injured birds that passed through her care on their way back to health and freedom. She approached all of them with the same practical tenderness her father brought to everything, and the combination of that with her mother's fierce and articulate commitment produced a 5-year-old who could bandage a wing and argue for its owner's rights with equal competence. Ruth had been asked by a teachers' college in Austin to present her primer and her methods at a regional education conference, an invitation that had arrived in a letter so formal it initially made her think it was something legal. She read it twice and then showed it to Matthew, who read it once and said, "You should go." "It's a week," she said. "The children." "Thomas and Eleanor and I will manage a week," he said. "Carl and Dolly have already indicated, unprompted, that they will assist as required, so really we'll be enormously overstaffed. You should go." She went. She stood in front of a room of 40 teachers and school board members in Austin, Texas, in the spring of 1887, and she talked about education with the full force of everything she believed, and everything she had learned in 9 years of teaching children in small western towns, and the room was one of the most engaged audiences she had ever spoken to. And afterward, 3 teachers came to ask her questions that turned into conversations that turned into the beginning of a correspondence that would continue for years. She came home on the stage on a Friday evening, and Matthew was at the station, which she had not asked him to be, and was entirely glad of. He helped her down and held her for a moment on the main street of Colton Creek, And then Thomas came from behind his father's back at full speed, and she caught him, and Alina came more steadily after, and the four of them stood in the May afternoon on the street of the town that had kept her, and Ruth Bailey Keating held on to all of it. "How was it?" Matthew asked. "It was wonderful," she said. "Tell me what happened here." "Captain lost another tooth," Alina reported. "We think he has two left." Thomas drew an entirely new section of the territory map, Matthew said. "I can show you when we get home," Thomas said, with the urgency of someone who has been saving something for the right moment. "I added all the major rivers." "I want to see all of it," Ruth said. They walked home in the May light, the four of them, through the town that had been 3 streets now since the previous year, and would probably be 4 by next summer, past the church that stood upright these days, and the school that had her primer on every desk, and the store where Dolly Webb was watching through the window, with the transparent pleasure of someone observing the exact ending they were hoping for. That evening, after dinner and the map presentation and Alina's full update on Captain's dental situation, and the various other reports that a week's worth of family life had generated, and after both children were in bed with the particular settled completeness of children who have had a full day and know they are safe, Ruth and Matthew sat on the porch in the warm evening, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into the solid warmth of him, and they watched the stars come out over the Texas plains. "I've been thinking," Matthew said. "About what?" "About how it was before you came here." He was quiet for a moment. "I had built something I was proud of. I had work I believed in. I wasn't unhappy." He turned slightly so he could look at her. "But I was waiting for something I couldn't name, and I didn't know I was waiting for it until it stepped off the stage in a cloud of dust and walked into the general store and looked at everything in it with those eyes of yours." Ruth listened to the night. "People kept telling you to be less," he said. "Your whole life, you were told you were too much of everything. And every single thing they tried to reduce you for is something I have spent these years being grateful for. Every opinion and every argument, and every time you refuse to be moved, and every time you cry one tear and tell me you're not crying." He paused. "I was looking for exactly that amount, Ruth. I didn't know it until I found it, but I was." She turned to look at him in the dark, and the starlight was on his face, and his gray-green eyes were the same color they had been the first time she saw them in Horace Webb's store and every day since. "I know," she said. "I know you were." She kissed him there on the porch in the warm Texas night, with the crickets beginning and the cattle quiet in the dark fields and their children asleep inside the house they had built together. And she felt the fullness of a life that had been called too much by everyone who hadn't understood what they were looking at, and had turned out to be, when it found its right place, exactly enough. The primer went into its 3rd print run in 1888, and was adopted by the territory's education board as a recommended text. Ruth continued teaching and continued expanding the curriculum, and Maggie Greer, now 20 years old, and enrolled in a women's college in Austin on a scholarship that Clara Frost had spent 3 years engineering, wrote Ruth a letter that said, among other things, that the most important thing that had happened to her education was being told at the age of 10 that her mind was worth developing. Ruth read the letter in the kitchen and cried without any of her usual resistance to the activity. And then she wrote back and told Maggie that the feeling was mutual. Thomas turned 10 in the spring of 1889 and asked for a trip to see the Capitol in Austin, and Matthew organized it with the patient thoroughness of a man who takes his children's desires seriously, and they went all 4 of them on the train. Because there was a railroad connection now, the frontier was changing in all its ways. And Thomas stood in front of the state buildings with an expression of such transported interest that Ruth and Matthew stood behind him and exchanged the look of parents who can see something very clearly forming in their child and are glad of what they see. Alina turned 7 and graduated from riding calico in the paddock to riding her own horse, a compact and willing bay pony that Matthew had found after months of looking for exactly the right temperament. and her face when she first rode him out of the gate and onto the open range with Matthew on calico beside her was something Ruth would see, with complete clarity, for the rest of her life. In the summer of 1889, Ruth discovered she was expecting a third child. She told Matthew in the kitchen on a morning in July with the heat coming through the windows and Thomas out at the barn with Carl and Alina asleep late for once. And she told him because she knew, and because she told him everything. And his response was the same as it had always been, the absolute stillness of a man who is experiencing something too large for quick movement, and then the full, open happiness of his face when he looked up. "A third one," he said. "A third one," she confirmed. "Will you stop teaching? For a while. After the primer is in its 4th edition, I'll stop for the season, maybe 2. And then you'll go back. And then I'll go back," she said. "Obviously," he said, with the smile she loved. The third child was born in February, which had proved itself, again and again, to be the month the Keatings received their most important things. He was a boy this time, large and emphatic in the manner of his older brother and dark-haired in the manner of his mother. And he arrived on a cold, clear night when the stars were very bright, and the prairie was very still, and Ruth labored through it with the matter-of-fact determination she brought to everything difficult. And when it was over and the baby was in her arms, she felt the particular exhausted wonder of it that never entirely diminishes no matter how many times you have been there. They named him Robert James Robert for Matthew's father, James for no particular historical reason except that it sounded right when they said it together. Thomas, who was 10 and more articulate about his feelings than most adults, looked at his new brother with a long and serious expression and then said, "He looks like Alina looked." "He does a bit," Ruth agreed. "I suppose it's fine," Thomas said, with the dignity of someone who has considered the matter and rendered a fair verdict. Alina, who was 7 and had very definite views about most things, immediately assigned herself to the project of young Robert's welfare with a comprehensive seriousness that meant no one else could place him down anywhere without her consultation. She informed both her parents that she would be in charge of the singing aspect of his care, as she had determined that singing was important, and she began doing so with a thoroughness that Robert appeared to find entirely satisfactory. Matthew held his youngest son on the first evening, sitting by the fire in the ranch house with the winter pressing against the windows, and Ruth watched him from across the room, this man who had fixed the leak in her schoolhouse and looked at her across a table and told her she was exactly the right amount, this man who had stood beside her and built a life with her through all the seasons it takes to know a person truly. And she felt the thing she always felt when she looked at him, which was the particular quality of peace that comes from being completely and finally in the right place. Robert grew and Thomas drew more maps, and Alina rode farther into the range, and Colton Creek added a 4th Street, and then a proper bank building with a stone facade that the entire town regarded with a pride somewhat out of proportion to its size. Clara Frost, who had never seemed to age through any of it, organized the town's 20th anniversary celebration in 1892 with the brisk efficiency of a general planning a campaign, and the whole county came out for it. And there was a platform built in the main street and speeches that were mostly mercifully short, and a fiddle player, who was the son of the fiddle player who had played at the church social where Ruth and Matthew had first properly met, which struck them both as exactly the right kind of continuity. Ruth spoke at the celebration because Clara had decided she should, and because there was no effective way to disagree with Clara when Clara had decided. And she stood on the platform in the August afternoon and looked at Colton Creek, all of it, the people she had known for 14 years and the newer arrivals, and the children she had taught who were now young adults, and the 3 children of her own in the crowd with their father, Thomas tall and serious, Alina bright-eyed, small Robert watching everything with his father's gray-green eyes. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stage in the dust of this town's main street on a spring day in 1878 with a trunk and a rifle, and a letter of introduction, and the bone-deep knowledge that she had been crowded out of everywhere she had tried to build a life. She talked about what Colton Creek had given her, and what she had tried to give it back, about the children who had grown up in the schoolhouse, and the primer that was still being used across the territory, and the community that had formed over the years from people who had, in various ways, all come from somewhere else and chosen to stay. She talked about what it meant to belong somewhere, genuinely and fully, and what it required of both the place and the person. Afterward, Matthew found her at the edge of the celebration while the fiddle was playing, and Alina was teaching Robert some rudimentary version of a dance, and Thomas was standing near the food table with the expression of someone who is older than his years, but has remembered just in time that he is still 12. "That was very good," Matthew said. "Thank you," she said. He took her hand. After 14 years, the warmth of it was still the same specific warmth it had been on the flat rock at the edge of the creek. "I have been meaning to tell you something," he said, in the tone he used when he had been thinking about something for a while. "What's that?" He looked at her in the afternoon light, in front of all of Colton Creek, on the main street of the town where they had built everything they had, and he said what he had said 1,000 different times in 1,000 different ways since the night she had stood on the porch in the dark and told him she loved him. "You are," he said, simply and completely, "exactly the right amount. You always were, and I am the luckiest man I know because I got to you before you believed anything else." Ruth Bailey Keating looked at him, at this man who had been looking for exactly her, and she smiled the smile that she saved for him, the one that she had discovered she had only once she had someone to give it to, the one without any walls or armor in it at all. "Dance with me," she said. He laughed and took her hand and pulled her toward the fiddle music and the dust and the afternoon and the celebrating town, and she went willingly, completely, with nothing held back too much for some places, just enough for this one, for him, for the life that had turned out to be, against all the odds and the tellings and the small towns that had tried to make her smaller, exactly and precisely and abundantly right. The stars came out over the Texas plains as they always did, enormous and uncountable and entirely indifferent to the particular human happiness occurring beneath them, which is the way of stars, and below them in the main street of Colton Creek on a summer evening at the end of an ordinary century that had been, for Ruth and Matthew Keating, entirely extraordinary. The fiddle played and the children danced and the town celebrated, and two people who had found each other in the particular way that people sometimes find each other, completely, finally, without remainder held on and kept going.